Hi, welcome to week 7. This week we look at the stories of the Exodus narratives, and we focus on them primarily as stories. In the reading quiz that you'll take this week, you'll review some of the reasons why historical matters are complicated in these stories. But there are other reasons that we want to focus on the stories as stories, and that will be explained especially as you deal with the theological Bible commentary entries. In this video, I'd like to first of all establish just how rich these stories are, and remind you that in looking at narratives such as the ones we're dealing with here, that we can well use literary analysis, as reviewed in the resource that you read last week. The document that I've pulled up here, which you'll also find posted for this week, offers an analysis of the plot of Genesis 1 through 14. We can actually call this kind of an analysis several things. It is literary in the sense that it's looking at the shape of the plot, but my colleague Greg Carey in New Testament, as well as others too, sometimes call this type of analysis internal structure, because it is the structure that is internal to the set of materials that you're looking at. There are many different ways to discern a structure within a material, but it's important to look for clues within the text rather than to simply impose your own assumptions about the text on it. My analysis of Exodus 1 through 14 discerns a U-shaped plot, as I'll show here. Notice that the story of Exodus starts out with the Israelites strong. They've multiplied, they've increased in great numbers, but quickly, in the fast pacing of the plot, there is a downturn in fortunes. And a pattern begins that will be repeated for quite a while. That the king, in this case the Pharaoh, decrees one thing, a decree of death, and it is repeatedly thwarted by Israelite resistance. The first example of this actually is not one of resistance, but of acquiescence. The king says to the people, "Let us deal shrewdly with them." And they did. But in the next instance, when the king says to the midwives, "If it's a boy, kill him," the midwives actually refuse. They did not do so. And in the third time, when the king commands the people, "Throw the boys into the Nile," it is two women who actually model the resistance. Moses' mom sees the child and acts to save, as does Pharaoh's daughter. She sees the child and acts to save. Notice that several women, in this case 4, 2 midwives, Moses' mom, and Pharaoh's daughter, act to save Moses. They see his distress and act to save. Moses actually follows their pattern when he sees oppression and acts to save, in saving his fellow Israelite from the taskmaster. That in turn returns Pharaoh to his usual mode of action. He seeks to kill Moses, who actually is able to escape. There's an interesting turn in the plot at this point. In chapter 2, verse 23, for the first time we hear that God sees, notices, the Israelites and their oppression and acts to save. You might notice that the women have already done this, as has Moses, and God is actually following the human initiative. God's act of saving, however, takes much longer than the others, and in fact it continues throughout the rest of the narrative. That is, the narrative of Exodus 1 through 14. God initiates God's plan, communicates it to Moses and Aaron, who in turn communicates it to Pharaoh, is encapsulated in a famous phrase, explicitly said in 9:1, "Let my people go." But the Pharaoh, as he's shown in his characterization before, will refuse that. He refuses not only once, twice, but also through a series of 9 of the plagues. In each case, in a pretty traditional patterning, the plague comes, something happens, but Pharaoh still refuses to let the people go. In chapter 11, the 10th plague begins to break that pattern. In this case, the plague is announced in fairly extended tones. The story is interrupted for instructions about how the Passover will be commemorated, and then the plague is actually executed. 13:17 breaks the pattern that we've seen going on since 2:23. Finally, Pharaoh does let the people go. That breaks the pattern of Pharaoh's refusal. However, he quickly reverts to his previous pattern, changing his mind and refusing to let the people go, so that God again sees and acts to save by parting the Sea of Reeds. That's why this plot can now turn up to its U, because in 1430, as chapter 14 ends, God saved Israel that day from the Egyptians. A plot analysis like this helps us to see part of the ways that the author was communicating. How we can see some of the things that Hiebert will talk about in the Theological Bible Commentary, of the interesting interplay between human initiative and divine initiative. And we can also see the powerful way in which throughout Pharaoh is characterized as the opposition not only to the Israelites but to God. That may explain why the narrator goes to such great lengths to show that this is all God's doing, even to the point that God would harden Pharaoh's hearts and the hearts of the Egyptians in order for it to be shown that God alone has saved. Pointing out that even if the Pharaoh would have turned around, he might have gotten credit for it. So in this story, it's important that God is the one that sees and saves. In the next segment of the video, I'm going to move to particularly the Theological Bible Commentary and how it builds on this literary analysis to talk about the role that that story has played in community religious understanding. As promised, we now turn to the Theological Bible Commentary. And in this segment of the video, I would suggest that you have both your Bible open and Olson, and that you stop the video, that you pause in order to kind of integrate each of the questions that I'm asking you. Importantly for understanding Olson's entry in the Theological Bible Commentary is to understand what he means when he calls Exodus 1 through 18 a master narrative. I encourage you to stop at this point, review what Olson says, and make sure you could explain in your own words what he means by master narrative. Next, review what Olson says about when he believes this master narrative was first composed. When does he believe the material was written, and for what purpose? Look at what he claims it was doing in the ancient world at the time of its author. I turn now to a quote outside of the Theological Bible Commentary that actually comes from the Eerdmans Dictionary of the Bible. It claims that the ritual of Passover, which is at the core of this story, is situated within the larger narrative context that provides details not only for the narrative enactment of the ritual in the past, but also in the enactment of the ritual in the future. The genres of story and instruction are complementary and interactive. See if you can understand what this claim is making. How can you see in the text itself both a concern for the then, that is, the story at the setting of Moses and in the time of the Exodus, and also the now of the writer? Look particularly at Exodus 12 and 13 and see if you can see for yourselves the shift of talking about the time of Moses and Aaron and the Egyptians, and the shift to talking about the time of the author himself. Why can we see that this story is crafted in a way that speaks to the needs of the time of its author? This quote from Collins reminds you that the Exodus story is more important than any other biblical story in establishing Israelite and Jewish identity. We can see this in the past, how much in the Bible the story of the Exodus will be remembered and recited. So it's important for you to think about this question. What does the master narrative say about Israelite identity? According to this narrative, who is Israel and who is God? Many of you know that this story is not only a story for the period of its author, but the story of Passover and the Exodus is incredibly important to contemporary Jewish life and practice. I'm including a link to a funny but nonetheless instructive video that reminds us of how these rituals continue to take on meaning in the present. I've also included among this week's materials a blog post that I wrote trying to explain that what this story means to Jews is not the same way, it doesn't mean the same thing that it means to modern Christians, which leads me to believe that perhaps it's not the best thing for Christians to observe Passover meals in the present.